Welcome back, climbers. I'm your co-host, Kaylee Floyd, and this is another episode of Climbing Mount CMMC. In today's episode, Bobby is talking with Matt Lee about the top 10 things that MSPs should be doing. So, let's get into this episode.
All right, everybody, we're back doing our top 10. We're going to go into number 6, which for those of you that may not have watched the first episode that we did of this, I'll go through them really quickly. Number 1 was adopting a framework. Number 2 was creating a system security plan. Number 3 was having appropriate policies that tie to your security plan. And then 4 was having a reoccurring review process. And number 5, which we were very passionate about, was tabletop exercises, making sure that you're going through, you're human. Things are going to happen. You have lots of other people that are human involved in it. Mistakes will happen, and you're going to have to then have an incident. So going through that tabletop response is great. And now that takes us to number 6, which is on security awareness, training our individuals to be better at knowing how to identify those threats, IOCs, and other types of things like that. So, all right, what do you think about that, Matt?
Well, let's unpack what you said there. Training.
Okay. Yes.
I would agree that most MSPs and most companies are doing the training. So let's say we're doing training, comma space, that actually affects change and teaches people to make better decisions. I would actually argue the latter half of that is not true. And the latter half of that is where the room for growth is, right? And we talk about having internal security training and phishing campaigns. If you really get down to it and we talk about it, if you look at some of the safeguards in CIS and you start with 14.1 and 14.2 and you get into this cadence, it actually starts getting into things that we are not doing. Like, are you really actually teaching each of your companies directly how their system needs to be interacted with for data sensitivity? Are you actually saying this EMR dumps files down to an Adobe file when you print it? If you do not clear this directory, then you will have some challenges of accidental exposure. We need to make this part. Are you actually getting down to that? Or are you just training of bad guys do bad things and make you click on things? Like, at some point, I think there's a giant gap in actual security awareness training and actual efficacy and change. Then taking on top of it, people that are doing phishing campaigns, in my mind, are often doing it wrong. There's a TED talk that a woman gave about social proof when it comes to cybersecurity. And one of the things she spoke about was saying that when we talk about phishing, we've all done it before. We've all said, ooh, Bobby clicked. Look at that. Bobby's bad. And he clicked on the file. We're going to talk about it. You got me, Matt. You got me. That doesn't affect change. In fact, it actually creates this fun in some ways. But what if we did it differently? What if we took the concept of social proof? And what is that? Well, social proof, as bastardized and explained by me, is this understanding that if I took a human who spoke the language, who didn't have any of the cultural experience of a particular location or city or place, right, and I dropped them off in that environment, very rapidly I would observe them doing the same things everyone else is doing. Why? Because we want to belong. The only reason we ever sat down at a campfire together and shared our food instead of ravenously fighting each other off for it is this need as humans to have community and to belong and to feel part of a tribe and to feel part of something. And so why the hell would you ostracize the failures by saying you suck instead of praising the good that you want people to be like? Instead of focusing on those failures, you'd go, man, this is awesome. Look at these people that 80% didn't click on the email. You guys are the champions and the protectors of this organization. Well, that would make Bobby want to actually be rewarded. You do not beat a dog into being a good dog. There's no scenario punching a dog makes it love you more. You have to absolutely focus on the positive. And I think that's one thing why when you say this one, it triggers me, but it is accurate to bring here because you would be doing 6 already if you were following 1. I think it's perfect to call out here in some of these later ones, and maybe this is Johnny foreshadowing of what you're going to bring, that even though we've said it, it doesn't mean we're doing it well. And it goes back to 4. Am I actually training my people? Are they clicking less on the bad stuff? Are they actually doing the right things? Is a efficacy test we haven't been doing. And so you're really kind of just repeating that pattern with 6 of saying 4, are we actually validating these things? Are we looking at it? Are we working on it? Are we functioning on it? And then the other piece I'd focus on as 6 is, holy crap, you're going to have to get deeper and broader. You're going to have to get very specific. I need to be teaching my accounts payable people about the attacks and the threats that they're going to face. Hey, guess what? Some bloke's going to call and say they want, this is Bobby. I want to change where my paycheck's going to the HR people. Hey, by the way, Kaylee, this is Matt. I need to pay my bill. I need you to pay me. Here's my new wire instructions. Like, you need to train them about the things they're going to be type specific to their role and their work. And guess what? That's a framework. That's a safeguard. I think it's 14.9, right? So you're getting into these things that are saying we need to be more efficacious. We also need to be broader. We also need to be deeper. And we need to start planning for these events, back to our tabletop, of looking at what happens if one of these fails. If I do have a phishing event, what does it look like? Tabletop through that. Get the hearts and minds bought in so that when they take that training, they're actually there to learn. They actually want to not fail. Anyways, I'll get off my dang soapbox. I'm gonna fall and break my neck on this one, but you triggered me on number 6.
No, I love it because I feel like with the training, having the ability that if you do a campaign, like let's say you do a phishing campaign, emphasizing and having the ability of KPIs to be able to track the amount of correct reports, I think is probably is the most important thing. That's one of the things when we do our awareness training is we're like, okay, if we send, and we actually say this, if we send 100 fake emails, how many reports should we get?
Sure.
We should get 100. We want everybody participating.
40%. I think if you're real with yourself, it's less. I mean, a lot may ignore it, but how many are taking that extra step to actually report it? I think is your point there, right? You're now, that's a great way to trace efficacy is, do they care enough about the organization to want to report it? Now, you risk this gamification of they're actually just showing that they caught it, and that's the reason they're flexing. But you would also, in my mind, want to track reporting of non-phishing testing emails. In my mind, if I was trying to find a stat to see my efficacy, I wouldn't want to see reporting of stuff I didn't send as a test. I would want to see reporting of stuff that's actually, maybe even if it's real or it's good, I think I would track the fact that people are getting training and are learning to do it by the fact that they submit ones that you have to come back and go, no, Matt, that's actually a legitimate email. Yeah, it's spammy, but it's not a virus. It's not malware. It's not somebody attacking you. So that's how, to add to that, that's one thing I'd add is I'd track the efficacy of the actions that are not tied to the actual testing program.
And one of the things that we say is the best antivirus is between the keyboard and the chair, is what we always tell our clients is explaining to them is that you really, that training aspect is really important.
So you've already focused on the social proof. That's why I love you, Bobby. We're already there. Like, you didn't focus on, so many people say we actually focus on that failure. We actually focus on, like, everything you said so far has been focusing on the positive. We want to focus on how it actually increases your capabilities. We want to focus, so I just wanted to point out that even in your own language, you are focusing on the positive and not the negative, right? It's
the people, you really want to get them up to speed, and an ounce of prevention here cannot be emphasized enough, because it will.
Well, at the end of the day, okay, let's say you're going to become a bomb tech. Whose fault is it if you get blown up the first bomb you ever touch? Is it you being a shitty bomb tech, or is it them giving you poor advice, strategy, processes, teaching, training, and decisions when you're ready to go touch the bomb, right? Like, I think you get into this balance of it's the company's duty to teach the bomb tech before they go touch the bomb. And I think you're finding that balance shifting to where you can't just say the employee sucked and they got hit. You can say, I sucked because they got hit. I did not teach them well enough. I didn't help them understand the implications. Like, I would see that as me failing, not the employee, in a lot of cases.
I was invited by a school to come and do a security presentation. And I asked them, I said, how many fire alarms drills do you do in the year? And they said 10. And I said, how many security awareness trainings do you do in the year? And they said, well, this is the first one. And it was like, the start of the year, Yeah. And I'm like, well, how many are you planning on doing throughout the year? And they all kind of looked at each other. And I'm like,
this one was a one-off event. Aren't we done?
Yeah.
Aren't we trained?
How many spam attacks? How many fires have you really had? You look at fire because you've been trained in that, but security awareness trainings, a lot of times they seem to fall by the wayside.
You also make another point, right? We often, as humans, attribute value to the things that are most immediately impactful to human life. And the things that are most transparent to that, right? Active shooter training. Every school right now in the United States has an active shooter training on a recurring basis. They have had a fire training for a long time. In fact, during the missiles and the Cold War, they had trainings on getting under the desk so you'd be at least in a weird fetal position when the explosion went off. But the point is that we've always had these things that tie back to something that is as salient as human life. And yet when you get into things like cybersecurity that could have impacts on human life, that you're seeing that attribute starting to be made, that you now have more understanding and bringing that in. The problem with IT and technology and security is it's very esoteric and it's not always directly attributed to human life. But there's some interesting pieces of it. Like maybe the Russian missile commander should have been trained not to use Strava and connect with rando people, because when he was shot on his run, he was surprised that one of the people that was on his Strava followers was the head of the intelligence service for Ukraine. And so you start getting into this understanding of technology can have impact on human life. Privacy can have impact on human life. And, we're seeing it more. Anyways, get off on a tangent here, but I do believe that, I don't know how I got off on this tangent that far, but anyways, technology is going to be more and more where that training will be included as we understand it more and how much of an impact it actually does have on our lives from a security perspective. And
well, let's switch gears to number 7 here. And I think this one is very near and dear to CMMC heart, and that is change control. This is one of the top areas that are not met by most organizations, and that is having a mature change control process that outlines how things are going to happen. Because you might have a configuration document on how to set up workstations and have set up your 365 container. But if you don't have a change control process, you can run into some problems. Matt, can you kind of talk about
that? I'll start by telling on myself, in that when I was the director of security and Matt Topper was the director of compliance at our former MSP, my change control process early on was, hey, Matt, I'm changing something, or hey, Matt, changed something. And that was the worst it could be, right? Like it's not change control. It's change. It's like turning on your blinker after you turn, right? Like this is not the same thing. The blinker is meant to be indicative of you turning. So anyways, I think having a good change control process is actually requisite for any of the others to succeed. I don't know that I'd put it at 7, but I also do agree it's at 7 in the sense that you need to be able to have a good basis of what I want to have as a start, and then start implementing change control. And I know this is going to sound wrong. I maybe somebody will like throw rocks at me for this statement, but if we had tried to implement change control in the early formative stages of what Matt Topper and I were building, we would have failed. It would have been so bad, it would have never made it. But once we got to a certain base level of stasis of 80%, 70%, 60%, wherever you find that number to be accurate, having effective change control is the only way you finish the rest of that percent. Because at some point, you can't just change something and not be aware of its impact on other things. At some point, the interdependencies of the systems gets large enough that you're not going to be able to make a decision of what this change impacts that person and what it impacts to this part of the business. And don't think about just the security impacts of change control, but really, what about business? What if when I'm trying to thread the needle of making sure that my actual risk meets up with my business objectives, and now I'm changing stuff, did I actually step outside of that risk posture? Did I destroy the ability to do business? Did I lock somebody out? I had somebody jokingly say to me earlier, Matt, I set up a SharePoint site for us to share this document with my external marketing partners, and it's locked down so tight they can't even access it. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, but that's kind of the point. You need to make sure business flows and that the things you're doing are going to impact it, and it's not going to do that. Or if it is, you're going to be aware of it and you're going to make the decisions ahead of time. And anyways, getting off on yet another tangent for 7, but change control process, it is not possible if your object you are measuring continues to change. And so would you
consider patching change control? Would you how do you see those working together? Which is a little bit of a tangent, but
in some ways, I guess you make a point. Like I am introducing some change to this system, and almost in some ways, change control and patch management could be antithesis, but also beneficial. And here's why. Imagine you have a patch that you're needing to research, and it's going to maybe break stuff you're doing. This is the age-old reason people didn't want to patch until it was tested. I mean, you've been an MSP. How many clients have gone, all right, well, we'll have our early patchers because they're not likely to have this problem, but we're going to wait on this group's going to be in patch group 7, and they're going to wait until 12% of this patch has been deployed on, so they make sure that it doesn't break this shitty software they've got here or this horrible configuration they should have never done here. And so I think when you start getting into it, in my mind, line in sand, change management does not encompass patching if it's in a perfect world, because the patching of it should be something that is allowed to be done for security reasons instantly. And I get into arguments about this, right? Like, but making the system function all the time is the most paramount. Yeah, until you have that massive breach and you didn't patch it, and now I'm talking about it. Look at all the move it vulnerabilities. Look at all the log4j. A lot of those people were probably not patching because they were in a change management, or we're going to wait and see. We got to wait for this to test. We have to do it in our dev environment before we. And those are all true statements. But if you look at how technology gets simpler over time, more and more of this is not on my shoulders. More and more of this is on somebody that's Azure holding the way they're doing change control so that they can make sure they're patching the things they find, not Matt doing that. And as you see that,
Right.
look at the difference in, serving a Exchange server versus an Office 365 license or a Google license. I don't want to be specific on Microsoft. But if you look at what it took to actually run an Exchange server, I needed to have change control. Like, don't move this VM to another host because I need this type of storage for these things. You had to do all of this other stuff that mattered that is way less impactful when you have a shared responsibility matrix and others are taking some of those pieces of it. So change control processes being tied into patching, I think you could argue either way. If I had to put my line in the sand, it would be that patch management is not a function of change control, other than we decide what cadence of patching impacts my other systems. And that's the piece I'd probably get to.
That's the way I lean. The way that I look at it is that your change control must be your patching must be part of your change control process from the perspective of you have a process that you have approved that you're following how you're going to do your patching.
Totally agree.
Totally agree. So you've created that. Now, that's not like every time you go to apply a patch, you're going to do change control, but it has to be part of your change control process.
I will patch on Tuesday at 4 p.m. every time Microsoft releases, and those pieces will be matriculated or titrated out to all of the field over X and following that. And if you're going to change that, then yes, that needs to change in your change control. Nope, we're going to patch on Tuesday mornings now because we are finding a delta in how, whatever the answer is, that is what I would get at. So I think that's a good way to force us to look at this as a conversation, Bobby.
Well, and I think that takes us into our next point, which was number 8, which is for that one is going to be, I'm just making sure I'm taking my notes here, vulnerability scanning. Because why would you want to do vulnerability scanning, and why would we might consider that after what we just talked about?
Well, we're talking about Control 7 again, right? And you're talking about vulnerability scanning. It's already part of CIS, so it's already going to be in a framework. So why are we mentioning it again? Why are we going there? I think in my mind, it would have to be you're really trying to inspect, as Rex Frank tries to say, right? Inspect what you expect. And it's this understanding of why would I want to do vulnerability scanning when I'm already patching? Maybe it didn't work. Maybe it's still susceptible. Look at Print Nightmare. There were 7 patches for Print Nightmare, each with different efficacy and function. Like, come on, man. Like, sometimes vulnerability scanning is not just looking for patches, but looking, is the vulnerability closed? And so when we get into it, I would broaden it from just vulnerability scanning to more and more ways to validate and cross-validate in controls and safeguards that I've put in place. Is this safeguard doing its job? Yes or no?
Good point.
Right. And in this case, it would be safeguards for patching. Vulnerability scanning is a validation method for the safeguards of patching. Is it patching? Is it following those windows? Is it successful? A little joking out there aside, but I can talk about failures of 8 and 7 at the same time in your mechanism. When I had a third-party NOC company that was doing my patching, and a third-party NOC company that was a separate division of that company that was doing my actual tickets and outages and management. And what was interesting is it was during the Server 2012 NIC challenges where you would have a network adapter that would crash based on certain scenarios, and you would lose access to the machine once you applied this patch. And there wasn't a fix yet from Microsoft. And so what would happen is NOC would see an unpatched machine and patch the NIC. NIC would go offline. Other NOC would find out the machine was offline and work to restore the VM and get it back from an infrastructural layer back functional. The client was down for a day. And the two of them went to war with each other. Every time Papa would fix it, Gamma would break it. And you get in this situation where it was just constantly in this fight. And it's an example where the change control process of saying we have an out-of-band challenge, we're needing to not patch this, we need to have this in place, wasn't able to be followed. And as a result, the vulnerability scanning detected that this patch needed to be applied and was being followed. And so you had this, anyways, it's an interesting play out, a little bit of a side tangent.
And I see some of these products or other people that are pushing that are like, oh, you need to be doing the vulnerability scanning like weekly or daily. Do you really need to have that level of cadence, or can you, is there, especially when you're looking at NIST or some of those other frameworks that are, the validation is considerably higher, right? So if you're doing a vulnerability scan and you're doing it daily, the level of logging of what you're doing, the activity of that is very, very high.
It's very verbose. There's a lot of plate spinning of stuff that's going to come out.
So do you want to be hitting that continually that much? Is there just more of a sanity as far as how often you would want to do
I'm gonna say something very John Madden is. You're going to need to be able to do it at the cadence that actually solves the vulnerability gap. So I don't, right? Like you're not winning because you're not scoring enough points. My point would be the vulnerability scanning, I would try to match the cadence of what my expected result is. What I mean by that is, let's say I'm getting patches weekly. Well, then scanning daily isn't necessarily going to help me unless I'm just trying to figure out how accurate I am at getting from that weekly state. So I would try to match the cadence of my patching. If I'm patching weekly, if I have the patches are released weekly, then I want to do vuln scans on a weekly basis as determination of how successful my patching was, right?
Okay.
And how successful that function was. But to your point, if you do it too much, you're going to create a lot of noise, a lot of things you go chase down that by the time you get to that machine, it's already been patched, it's already been resolved. And how are you picking out that noise from the cadence of that? I think that you have to have some understanding of the patch cycle to make a decision on the vuln scanning cycle. But that's not just stopped at patches, because vulnerabilities aren't just introduced by patches. And so you get into this challenge of, as soon as somebody opens 3389 on the outside world, I sure as shit want to know. As soon as somebody actually does, this firewall's been disabled, I want to know. And so I don't, there's not an answer to this question, Bobby. This is like, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll pop?
Ford or Chevy?
2, 3. I think whatever you can operationally sustain, however frequently you can do vulnerability scanning, and also be able to operationalize the results of that. If you simply can't get to it and you're going to scan once a day and you're going to come back with the same results and you have no way of tracking what went up or what went down or what that cadence shift was, like, was that machine patched 2 days ago and it's not patched now? Or is it actually systemically not patching? All of those things. So this is just on that type of vulnerability, just on patching, not change control in Microsoft Office or opening up a guest account when I wasn't expecting. Like, those are all things that could be creating vulnerabilities that are not tied directly to patching. And I think people need to stop just thinking of patching as the way we think of vulnerability, but all of the things. A vulnerability could exist out of a failure in Control 4 where I didn't set a baseline configuration properly, not because I failed a patch, right? And so there's more than that. So I guess it's a stupid and self-serving one, but whatever cadence you can sustain operationally that meets the needs, and if you're going to stay in business, then is not outside the timelines of whatever compliance or framework you are following. So there's the other challenge of this is, like, not only do I have to be able to operationalize it as a decision, like, oh, I can only do this once a quarter based on this, but if your guide says you have to do it once a month and you're not meeting that operationally, then you're going to fail there, right? And so there is a balance of those two, and it's always a balance. And I don't know.
Well, and I think that's why it's later on this list is the level of maturity. At first glance, you're like, oh, vuln scan, we should be doing that all the time. But when you start, like, as you start peeling back the layers as you're going through the explanation, it's not super simple. There's a level of maturity and complexity that you really need to understand when you're doing that, because just like you said, vulnerabilities aren't just patches. There's a lot more to it that you're trying to look at. And in order for you to do it,
there's more nuance, right? You've probably used something like a Nessus or other things that are going to do more explorative, actual probative things of saying, is this possible? But even then, when you get into, like, there's I won't say it. There's a company that handles a lot of sensitive data that has more than 10 perfect CVE 10s, a bunch of CVE 7.5s on one server that hosts everything for all of the data, including sensitive records for judges, police, all of that. And that system has vulnerabilities that some of them are defined as, it's a 7.5 if this condition exists, if that conditions exist. And so when you're trying to do vuln management, how do you sort through those things that might be there? Like, for example, early days of Log4j, I might still have that version of Log4j, but I might have mitigated it in another methodology, right? If you saw early on, there were methods of blocking Log4j from being able to do stuff. Same thing with PwnKit, other methodologies. In fact, when I was doing my PNPT exam, that I spent almost 22 hours chasing rabbit holes of stuff where someone set me up with a vulnerability that actually wasn't a vulnerability, but it would scan as so. And so you now get into that other challenge of, how do you track them? How do you know when there's a false positive? How do you see your crossover error rate, a false positive versus false negative rate? There's just so much that needs to go into it to be effective. And then you get yourself into other scenarios, like as an MSP, let's say you decide you're going to scan your clients' websites, right? A friend of mine did this. He was horrified when he found they were all on WordPress, 12 years old, tons of vulnerabilities, and no ability to make that change. No ability to work with it. They were hosted by some web provider that didn't care. It wasn't even in their purview. And now as an MSP, you have to decide, like, do I scan that when I have proof that I didn't actually have the ability to remediate it? How do I manage that? Do I have to talk about it with my client every time I talk to them now? Is that part of it? Or do I just choose not to have scanned it when it's not my operation of authority? There's really interesting things at play that go into that. And I think,
I think that dovetails into, no, it's fine. I think that dovetails into the number 9, which is tracking profitability, because as you start to peel some of these things back and you think to yourself, okay, here's this grocery list of things that I need to do for either internally or my client. If you're not tracking profitability, how can that impact your organization?
I'd take it even further to say, I sucked at this early on. I wasn't in charge of it, but I was part of the team and the leadership team that does this. We were constantly not growing our clients when they grew. We didn't build them enough. We maybe didn't have contracts renegotiated with people that put us at a lower profitability. And I think, to your point, that then would lower the efficacy in what I could deliver in the ways I'm maybe funded to be able to deliver some of these challenges and this growing need that I have. And so while I would think 9 doesn't seem like it matches and it doesn't fall in this, if you're not profitable, if you're not healthy, if you're not able to do this yourself, you're not going to be able to do it for them.
And if you're not around, you can't help them.
Yeah, 100%.
If you're out of business.
100%. You nailed it. Yeah, and so I think track profitability of your agreements, but I'd also say track risk and its aggregation too. And what I mean by that is you might be profitable to a client that's not doing any of the things, and you're in a financial position of maybe being responsible for it. Maybe you filled out that insurance form.
Scary.
Maybe you're doing those things. You also, even if you're profitable, need to make sure you understand what residual risk is being built up there. Right? What are these things? What does their choices do for my posture? I'll take you back to the web thing. If I go up and say, hey, your website's on WordPress 4 and it's got 4,000 vulnerabilities, my cat could actually pwn you. At some point, do you have a fiduciary responsibility to say that for the rest of your life with them until it's fixed? Even though you have no ability to fix it, even though you're not part of that ecosystem or change, because of your knowledge, did you create scenarios where you now need to deal with it? And so thinking about not just profitability, but what's that risk posture look like? What is its impact to your future profitability, right? When you think about it, transferring risk is insurance, right? If there's things I can do with risk. I can mitigate risk. I can avoid risk. I can transfer risk, right? Those are some of the things I can do with risk. Well, sometimes you think you've transferred risk and you haven't. Or sometimes as that client, maybe they've transferred some of that risk by you doing business with them and being the fiduciary that should have been smarter, that didn't actually make those suggestions. Like I've heard people say, I'll just have my client sign a waiver, and if they don't take it, we're fine. No, you just proved you're done trying to sell them something you know they needed, that you knew would stop a risk. You're going to prove that you're done, that risk doesn't apply to them anymore because they decided they didn't want to deal with it. I'm getting off on some my theories and my thoughts. I think it's
relevant
opinions,
though. But I really do, because I think you really have to look at the profitability and the risk that's involved in having that relationship. Let's say that you're engaging with a client that says, hey, I want to do CMMC. We're really, hell bent on getting this done. And you're like, okay, that's great. And then you start telling them these things that need to happen.
And they're like, well, we're not going to do that shit.
Right. Yeah. And you're like, how can we continue to do business?
These are incongruent, homie. These don't match.
Because then they might come back to you and say, okay, well, I'm not ready to be
you caused me a business injury because you didn't get me ready. I think you have to be aware of those.
Yeah, those types of things.
So track profitability, but track the risk that is being built up and the tech debt that's being built as well. Those are the other side.
Well, that brings us to our last one, which is peer group and having relevant conferences or things that you may want to attend, just so that you're more in the know. You attend a few of those a year.
One or two.
Can you talk to us about your opinion on that?
Well, for me, maybe this is self-effacing, and even aggrandizing potentially. I live in that space, right? I live in the community space. I live in that going and getting educated. And I believe that we are in a bit of a renaissance of this understanding as us as a community and what we have to do, and this charge and call to action that's playing out. And if you're sitting at home and by yourself, you're not going to be part of that renaissance. You're not going to be exposed to those things. And so I think, to your point, you've got industry conferences for CMMC specifically, for people in the defense industrial base specifically, for people serving doctors specifically, for title companies specifically. And so you start getting into these things where attending those relevant conferences and being exposed to your peers is going to make you better. I'll tell you, the first time I ever met Felicia King, and she's brilliant, but the first time I ever met her, I absolutely hated her guts. I disagreed with her completely, and I was completely wrong. She was right. But if I hadn't been exposed to that, I would have never been challenged in my belief in my position. And the thing we were actually arguing about was saying you have a 24/7 knock when you actually are outsourcing with some third-party company. Are you misleading your client? Are you actually making a false claim? And she felt very heavily you are, if you aren't disclosing that and talking about it. And I felt very heavily that you weren't. And now I would actually say I agree with Felicia. So I think, what's interesting about that is you can't feel so arrogant as to believe you know everything. Right. I hate being called an expert. I hate it. When people say it, I usually correct it. I like to say I'm an expert student. I like to say I have a lot of subject matter exposure. I like to say I've been there, done that, and learned it. But to say I know it all in a world that changes as fast as it does, that has so many new concepts, even though the old still hold true, there's still nuances and new things, then I think you'd be ignorant to believe you're the smartest person in the room. And for me, I go to these conferences to both be educated and to educate. And I think that speaks towards that interdependency. There's a speaker that lost his vision when he was in college. He was actually a professional golfer on his way to be a professional golfer, and he lost his vision in school. And he went home and he started to break down and lose his whole world. And he came back. And one of the ways he opens his talk about this experience for him was, he said, we're not dependent and we're not independent. Everybody likes to think independent versus dependent. And he does it by telling a story. He said a father and his son were walking down the street in the woods, and there was a tree blocking their path, and it was crossed across their path. And the father looked at this 12-year-old boy and said, son, with all your might, if you use all your might and all the things at your disposal, you can lift that tree up and you can move it out of the middle of the walkway. And the kid walks over there and he pulls on the tree and he pulls on the tree and he can't get it to move. And he looks at his dad angrily and says, you lied to me. You said if I used all my strength and all my ability, I could move this tree. And he said, you haven't done that. So the kid goes back and pulls on the tree again. And he comes back just as equally angry and says, Dad, now have I given it all? He says, no, you didn't ask for my help. All of the things at your disposal. And he goes on to say that we are interdependent. We are all dependent on each other as well as not. And so I think that's my argument for why I would go to these conferences, is to build that interdependency, to have that other knowledge sharing. I've gotten so much out of conferences myself. Eric Woodard sat down and told me about his experiences, and it allowed me to change my red line agreements with companies. It allowed me to be prepared for my own incident, my own experience. So yeah, I can't get on this one enough, but peer groups or people to hold you accountable, right? Peer groups are great at that side of it. And conferences, people to give you ideas, people to be exposed to, people to share and bounce your own stupid ideas off of and find out they're great or terrible and test your understanding of things. Like for me, you can't see this, but I think I've been to over 50 this year. Obviously, it's my job. It's what I get paid to do, and I live in it. But as an MSP, you have to carve out time. And as a client, you have to carve out time to go educate yourself, to broaden your horizons, to understand what the possibility is, and to understand what your competitors are doing, to understand what the industry is doing. We're in a magical place that exists in our world, that those things do.
And it doesn't... I'll ask this question. I'm not sure how you're going to answer. So, don't.
That's always
lawyer.
fun.
What's the lawyer? Never ask a question you don't already know the answer to, but I'm going to do it anyway. So here's what I'm going to ask. Let's imagine it's a pie, right? Of all the potential knowledge that you've learned as attending conferences, how much of that have actually come from the speakers?
Oh, not much. For a lot of reasons. I'd say there's some. And I would say that if you'd asked me that 5 years ago, and if you asked me that today, it's a delta. And I think, to what you're trying to get at, which is most of it comes from me meeting a Bobby and me and Bobby having a conversation, right? Most of it comes from those type of interactions. And that's where you get it in varying degrees of their own practitionerhood. I think why I say this is so poignantly that way is a lot of the reason I exist and what I do and why I'm doing what I do at PAX 8 is we've come from a world where the people standing on that stage paid to be there. The people that stand on that stage are there to financially recuperate the cost of the $60,000 they spent to sponsor this event and to have that 12 minutes of stage time. I didn't pay to get on stage. Jason Slagle doesn't pay to get on stage. Robert Chaffee doesn't pay to get on stage. You're starting to see a world where, to my Renaissance point, you're starting to actually ask the people on stage that have something to say, that don't have some financial recompense that comes right back to them as soon as they say it, that just want to grow the tide. I don't ever sell anything for PAX 8. In fact, I rarely mention PAX 8. The only reason you know it is I might have like a PAX 8 studio shirt on or something. But PAX 8 believes that if we can just educate people and empower them, then they'll naturally buy from us. And if they don't, they'll be better improved and we'll make the whole market better. And so you start seeing that shift. So back to your raw question of how much of it comes from the speakers. As you start seeing the Wes Spencers of the world and the other humans that are up there to just purely educate, John Strand, other players like that, you're seeing a shift in our world where I actually give a shit what they have to say and I'm going to learn from it. And I find myself more and more in those rooms learning something from it or being exposed to someone else that's in that same space that might have a thought about it. and it's shifting. If you had asked me 5 years ago, we were probably 5%. I would say now we're getting closer to 20 and 30% of what I get out of these conferences is from the actual presentations. My own shitty presentations included. So understand, I'm not pointing at just
I've seen an
else.
increase for sure. I think also curating the conferences you go to is very helpful because some are better at it. Like Ride of Boom, I had a great experience with that.
You could have curated that yourself 5 years ago, and they all would have been the same polished turd.
Yeah, I agree.
I think you're accurate about the change in the delta. To your point of like a Ride of Boom, or hopefully PAX 8 Beyond, and hopefully some of the other stuff where it's trying to change to education models. And at Beyond, the way we did that, every single person that spoke, other than the vendor paid ones, right, that exist, were people that did an RFP or request for papers and said, here's what I want to talk about. I'm a teacher and I want to talk about this. And they were all educators from our academy team. And that's why it was felt the way it did. But to your point, you can curate and find those, like MSP Geek, Ride a Boom, Rejection Con, like so many of these things are heading that. Me too. Are heading down that path. And you'll see more of those be educative. And the way I like to judge it is if you show me your console and try to teach me something in the lens of buy it because it has this feature, we're done. If you want to show me your console in some way to support some argument or claim you're making, or education that'll help people get it, and you show it in that way, I'm fine with that. And I think that's the shift. But the more we can bring in educators that don't have a direct financial reason to be there, I think the more value we'll make out of those conferences. I don't know how you support it from a financial perspective. So God bless me, I've got my own talent there.
It gets really challenging. I think that's why Rejection Con, for those of you who may not know it, it's purely online. So that presents some interesting possibilities of cost reduction. So you can start focusing more on the content. When you start getting 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 people attending a conference, it gets expensive and you got to figure out ways to kind of pay for that. That's why peer groups, I think, are really helpful too, because then those are focused on you. You're part of a member of a group
and they
of
bring
individuals.
An accountability structure, right? What a peer group really brings is, for the 5th time, Bobby walks in and goes, no, Matt, I didn't get my local admin accounts taken away. At some point, the peers are going to make you feel like crap, right? Like at some point, you're going to be held accountable. You won't want to come to the meetings. And if you do keep coming to the meetings, you'll eventually cave and do the shit you said you were going to do. So I think peer groups are probably that value there too.
Very true.
Good point out.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we'll wrap up here with our last one with peer groups and conferences. And I really appreciate you talking with me, man. It's always great watching your journey. Yeah,
I love top 10s. It's like donut media over here for cyber. Fantastic. So next we just need wish.com cyber products to talk about. And we've got
we got another hour for that one. So thank you so much. Again, just to reiterate all of those that are tuning in, we do this every week. This week has just been a little bit more. We don't always necessarily hyper focus on CMMC. This one is more broader towards the MSP community and things that are critical to the health and well-being before you start your journey to go towards CMMC. But even if you don't, doing these 10 things that we talked about will definitely make you better.
Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube to stay up to date on the latest CMMC news. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode and listen out for the next one. But until then, keep on climbing.